So hello, everyone. Welcome back to Digital Future Talks. Tonight, it's a great honor to invite two very important professors, Antoine Picon and Laurent Stalder. So I would like to firstly to introduce both of them. So in the post-pandemic era, Digital Future is recognized as a new form of knowledge sharing platform. For the past few days, the theoretical workshop with Antoine, Sanford, and New, the discussions was really attractive. I have to say, it is very meaningful education to the global audience for their understanding on the potential of digital futures. I would like to address today's invitation to Antoine Picon and Laurent Stalder, especially the moment during the COVID-19. I was invited to be the guest editor-in-chief for the special issue of Time Plus Architecture on the topic of construction, technology, and culture. So in the post-humanism, from the architect perspective, we are pretty much looking forward to have some theoretical and historical research as a beacon to guide us. We need to rethink how to construct the futures based on the past and the present, especially during the global pandemic. Now in the process of contemporary globalization, what would be the new relationships between construction technology and its cultural background? So what would be the new relationship, what would be the new boundary of digital in architecture or the intelligence in architecture? So what dialogues could emerge between the technological views and the construction cultures from the locality and the different global scenarios? The special issue invited Antoine and Laurent, as we know, two very extraordinary scholars to discuss on these two topics. Antoine Picon, who is a professor of history and architecture and technology at Harvard GSD. He is also chairman of the Foundation Le Corbusier, as well as a member of French Academy of Technology. His research revolves around the relationship between architecture and the city, technology and the society. He has published extensively on these questions, including the books All We Know, Digital Culture in Architecture, An Introduction for Design Professions, Ornament, the Politics of Architecture and Subjectivity, Smart Cities, a Specialized Intelligence, and the new coming book in 2021 would be Materiality of Architecture. So today, Antoine will give us a special talk, a lecture. The title is Architecture and Technology as a Cultural Question. And at the same time, I want to introduce Laurent Stalder, who is a professor of architecture history and theory at Department of Architecture at ETH, Zurich. The main focus of his research and publications is the history and theory of architecture from 19th to 21st centuries, where it intersects with history and technology. His main publication includes Hermann Miltesius, it's a German word, maybe pronunciation not right, who is born in 1861 to 1927. Atelier Bauer, a primer, was published in 2013. And Fritz Halle, architect und Forscher, which was published in 2015, and including the English publication Architect Machine 2017 and Architectural Ethnographic 2018. He also published a series of books, a series of articles, in various journals, including AA Files, Arc Plus, GM, Grey Rooms, the Journal of Architecture, etc. And he's also has been a visiting professor at Tokyo Institute of Technology in 2019. So firstly, I would like to invite Antoine Picon to give us a lecture around 40 minutes on the title, Architecture and Technology as a Cultural Question. So please, Antoine, give the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to share my screen. Ritual question, can you all hear me? That's fine?
Yes.
Good.
No problem.
Good. Yes. Okay. So today I am going to leave aside the digital. We've been talking a lot about the digital with Neil Leach and Sanford Quinter, but I will deal mostly with construction. But I hope that some of the things I'll say are more broadly relevant. So I changed my title, Architecture and Construction as a Cultural Question. Construction is often perceived as something completely objective because of natural laws, etc. And if such was the case, construction would teach us only these laws and how to make use of them for buildings. But my main argument here will be that history of construction reveals a far greater degree of complexity, for construction owes a lot also to culture. And here I will take culture in a both broad and narrow sense. So broad sense, culture can be defined as the system of belief, knowledge, and practices that contribute to ensure the coherence of a society at a given moment in its evolution. This is culture in the sense given to the term by anthropologists like the late Claude Lévi-Strauss. In that sense, construction is evidently cultural. I'll return to that very shortly. But I will also refer to culture in the narrower sense of cultural production, of the arts in particular. In that sense, architecture is a cultural production. One of my ambition is to reflect on how construction is an integral part of what makes architecture a cultural and even, let's say, the word artistic production. So if we take culture in a broad sense, it is pretty evident that construction is attached by all kinds of strings to the culture of its time. And of course, this goes through productive systems. It's evident that, for example, the American balloon frame technology is inseparable from American culture, from the rise of the suburban sprawl, and many other things. And understanding the structural principle of like American construction is revealing of some aspect of American culture. But we can go a bit further and notice that sometimes things are a bit more complicated than what may appear at first. For example, the Egyptian, when we think about Egyptian construction, we think mostly about these very massive construction. This is the Dendra temple in Egypt, or we think of Karnak, Luxor's, and others. But we tend to forget that actually the Egyptian did not use only that type of construction, but they used a lot of vaulted construction. But simply the vaults were used using adobe bricks. So actually, why did the Egyptian use one type of construction, excluding completely the vault from their temple, and using vaults for utilitarian buildings like granaries? And then we begin to see that actually construction, even when we look simply at how people built, is actually permeated by a lot of complexities. Closer to us, it's very striking for me how, for example, the French very seldom used curved trusses. And if you go to the Gare du Nord in Paris, it's very typical before taking the shuttle to London. You see actually a double pitched roof using what is called a colossal truss. And in St. Pancras, you will see curved trusses. So there are reasons for that. The French basically think in the 19th century that curved roof looked too technological. But then we realize, and that a station must be, following the rules of architecture. So a curved roof is too industrial in some ways. And then we begin to see that construction is indeed permeated by a lot of values, cultural values, etc. So I could take many, many other examples. For example, the American interest in cladding, which will lead to a very different structural approach than the European one. And someone like Gehry is clearly indebted to the enduring tradition of cladding in the United States. That said, not everything in the history of construction is easy to interpret. For example, how to make sense of this bridge, which is actually one of the first pre-stressed concrete bridges built by the Germans during World War II in Poland. There are a number of enigmas that still need to be deciphered in history of construction. But they also, and in some ways, you know, this deciphering is of course on its way. The cultural history of iron has developed a lot. For concrete, it has started only 15 to 20 years ago. We're beginning, however, to understand a number of really interesting things. For example, the link between concrete construction and the new objectivity that modern architect will try to promote. This is, of course, not a modernist building, but look at the way it's photographed. It's photographed in a way that clearly announces the way the modern will understand the volume, for example, the volumetric presence of architecture. And a researcher, Canadian researcher, Régent Legault, has argued that actually from that, you jump to this kind of new objectivity that will use silos, of course, edited by modernist architect, to look like, you know, this pure volume that announce modernity. So there are multiple links, sometimes a bit complex, sometimes using media like photography that enables to understand how construction is cultural. Now, there are many other ways to relate construction to culture. You can, for example, pay attention to key turning points. It is well known, for example, that the Crystal Palace was a turning point in the history of the world culture. It was, by the way, perceived by many country visitors to the building. The building hosted the first World Fair, and it is as if for the first time, the building was able to encompass the entire Earth. And, you know, it's quite revealing that contemporary philosopher Peter Sloterdijk refers again and again to the Crystal Palace as the dawn of a modernity that really begins to encircle the world with its technology. So that we can pay attention to moments like that, or, you know, the diffusion of concrete in the 20th century would be probably another moment. Another way to understand also architecture, construction as culture, is to take a more anthropological attitude. And, you know, it's fitting that since I'm paired with Laurent Stalder, Zemper, for example, was a pioneer in trying to relate construction to the way people lived in an everyday life. And, you know, Zemper is famous for comparing the Egyptian capital to Egyptian hairdressing. I won't enter into the detail of his dissertation, of his demonstration, but it's clear that between the way we build and the way we live, there are connections, which may be even more evident when we take, for example, vernacular architecture like this one in India. You know, vernacular construction is directly plugged in the system of, you know, of our everyday life. So what I'd like to develop now is a path I've followed, as for me, in a number of my publications, which is a kind of epistemological deconstruction of notion that we take for granted, and trying to understand how actually, instead of being granted by nature or whatever and self-evident, they are actually cultural constructs. Let's take, for example, the notion of material. For a very long, in the 19th century, there was a very clear opposition between material and structure. Material was more homogeneous and not composed as a structure. Material was, for example, this is the Bessemer converter that enabled to produce steel in the mid-19th century. So steel as a material was different from structure. Now, if we look back in history, we realize that actually clear-cut distinction between material and structure did not exist in former times. This is an example I've taken in the article I published in Time and Architecture, which is basically ties in 18th century masonry in the western city of France called Nantes, in which actually these ties are bolts. And with the idea that material can have actually the complexity of an organic structure. So the distinction were so much used between material and structure did not really function in the same way prior to the Industrial Revolution, which will lead me to a contrary point of view. Probably, if we want to understand our contrary vision of materials, we have to go back to this period of distinction, because today, between composite and smart materials, between biomimicry principle applied to material science, we are again entering a world in which materials can be structured in a very complex way. So all that to say that the notion of material has evolved considerably from one period to another. In addition, if you look at something like reinforced concrete, for reinforced concrete to be more than a system, to become a true material, there was a lot of standardization. And we tend to forget that most of the material we consider as such are the product of complex experiments, standards, convention, etc. For concrete, to something like 20 to 30 years through experiments and standardization to be able to consider that reinforced concrete was not a technique, but it was actually a material. So let's take an even more striking thing, which is structure. We believe that, from the down of construction, people have reasoned in terms of structure. But actually, for a very long time, there was some kind of unclarity about this notion. If you read Alberti, for example, you will find the fabric of the building, which is not exactly the same as structure. If you take the Gothic were very structural, but of course, they never talked about that. It's very striking, by the way, that until the 18th century, Gothic churches were no longer completely understood, and people found their architecture a bit too daring and not solid in the Vitruvian terms. Why not solid? Because they gave a kind of vertigo, as if they were, threatening the spectator because of, these very daring proportion. So all that to say that the notion of structure as we know it in architecture is something that developed not before the 18th century. Of course, people tried to hold things together and using what we would call today structural principles, but the notion of structure was not clearly defined. And actually, I mentioned the Gothic because it's actually the rediscovery of the Gothic qualities in the 18th century that led to the modern notion of structure, based on, among other things, on the notion of an inner circulation of efforts. So I won't enter into all the details, but there again, most of the notion we take for granted in construction are actually things which have a cultural history. The notion of materials has varied considerably, and I'm ready to bet that a material in classical China was probably not understood as the same way as it was in 17th century France. So materials vary, the notion of structure vary, etc. So now I'd like to go a bit further, and because many of the things I've mentioned may not be specific, they're true in general of technology and building technologies. What might be more specific to architecture is a kind of acute tension between two seemingly irreconcilable aspects, namely the intellectual and the affective. So let me try to explain that. On the one hand, construction is a very material activity, but there seems to be something in construction that points toward intellectual understanding. It was very evident for a 19th century theorist like Viollet-le-Duc, for whom Gothic was actually a mode of reasoning. Hence, by the way, the title of his major work, Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture, Reason Dictionary of Medieval French Architecture, as if reasoning was the basis of construction. And it's in a way true that when we assemble things in a building, we tend to follow certain patterns of reasoning. which beyond Milieu, a historian of art, Viennese historian of art, Erwin Panofsky, to his famous parallel between Gothic architecture and scholasticism, with the idea that in a given society, there are certain modes of reasoning, and these modes of reasoning have a link with the way we understand more generally how you assemble parts in the physical world. And let's not forget that terms like construction, architecture, etc., circulate from architecture and construction proper to domains like science and philosophy. More generally, in construction, there are things which have fascinated thinkers for a very long time. Take the vault. There is a very famous letter by poet and philosopher Heinrich von Kleist, German poet and philosopher, in which he is struck by the fact that actually what stabilizes a vault is actually the very tendency of each block to fall. And he makes a daring parallel between the vault, the way a vault functions, and the Kantian system. Don't ask me to enter into the detail right now, otherwise I will be still there tomorrow. But the vault has fascinated for a very long time all kinds of thinkers because it embodies, how multiple contradiction can actually stabilize mutually and create coherent systems. So all that to say that in some ways, construction may point toward the rational, toward the way we reason. In a number of articles and books, I've tried also to show how in the 18th century, the rethinking of construction around the theme of travation itself, inspired by the primitive hut, theorized by Abbé Laugier, led to these kind of churches in which the arches between columns were replaced by lintels, flat lintels. And that this is a church, 19th century church. And look, there is no arch. And this has in turn links with the kind of taste of the 18th century for clear-cut assemblage of constructive parts, but it could be also assemblage of argument, what 18th century philosopher and scientists call analysis and synthesis. And in some ways, what pleased the 18th century mind in that kind of church was this idea of a clear-cut assemblage, like a meccano, even if it was made of stone. So there are modes of reasoning that are related to modes of construction. Now, there is also something completely different, and which has more to do with the opposite, the affect, the almost physical effect produced by construction. And for that, I would take as a guide one of the greatest Spanish engineers of the 20th century, Eduardo Tojoja, who wrote in his 1957 book, The Reason of Structural Types, that vain would be the enterprise of somebody who would propose himself to design a structure without having understood to the backbone the mechanical principle of inner equilibrium. And what is important is actually more than understanding, it's actually to the backbone. That's to say, you have to feel. Construction is also something that produces sensation, and to truly master it, you must also integrate those sensations. How not to be, when you look at that, almost affected by this mix of weight, etc., that is still stabilized. So this is something that we experience in our body prior, so it seems, to any form of linguistic communication. The same is true of these vertiginous cantilevers that the modernist architect will use again and again. They have a kind of expressive power that seem to predate the invention of language, as if they were talking directly to the body. And something in construction actually points towards the physical, towards something that would have to do with the body. And actually, you could argue that the modernist taste for cantilever, etc., has to do with the modernist vision of the heroic body. It may be the body of the builder, but more generally, that construction points towards a kind of heroism of the body. So what do I want to convey through that? Perhaps that there are deep connection between things that may seem very different at first. On the one hand, intellection, the way we construct argument. On the other hand, the way we feel in our bodies. Now, contrary to a phenomenologist, I think the way we feel, the way we experience our body is changing through ages. So that actually the modernist body is not the same as the 17th century body to which the Vitruvian tradition referred to, nor to the country body. How do we understand our body in an age of digital culture, but also in an age in which we understand ourselves as an endless superimposition of networks? This is a neuronal network, biological neurons, that is. And of course, an interesting question would be, how do we today understand the relation between that and the new modes of construction, often very different from the traditional codes of assembling parts that have developed in the past decades? So all that to say that construction is something that points simultaneously to two things. One is the relation to language, to sophisticated intellectual culture. The other to this other aspect of culture that relates to our bodies, bodies which are not atemporal entities, but which evolve, which we understand and feel in different modes, in different societies and at different times. And I would say that construction in that respect is much a kind of emblematic of architecture, for architecture actually aims to do the same thing, to speak, so to say, after language, to speak a language that refer to ideas, to concept, and also to speak to the body, and in an almost immediate way. So in some ways, you may note I'm beginning to move toward this idea that actually construction may be a privileged way to understand how architecture relates to culture, but more as a cultural, as an expressive production. What can we learn from construction? Something about the capacity of architecture to be both intellectual and affective, both a discipline which is about to speak, but also something that has a strong gut-like component. Let me now move further by talking about construction as between truth and fiction. So let me there again try to explain what I mean by that. With the modern movement, we've got accustomed to the idea that the good construction was synonymous with truth to structure and to materials. But actually, as I've argued, structure and materials are actually evolving notions. So what about truth? Truth is a complicated thing in architecture, truth to construction. For example, the late 19th century, early 20th century American architect Louis Sullivan were remembered to be the first to give the skyscraper a convincing architectural translation. This is one of his most emblematic buildings, the Wainwright building in St. Louis, in which the nervosity of the frame, the steel frame, is expressed through the repetition of the brick columns in the facade. So all is fine. And it has been often said that Sullivan is the first to really achieve this architectural expression of the steel frame. Yes, but actually, if you look at the building, one column out of two has no steel in it. That said, if you were to suppress one column out of two, the overall expression will be less nervous, less like a staccato, expressing the new rhythm of the industrial age, of the steel age. So in order to be true to the spirit of the time, you have sometimes to use constructive lies. So it means that the relation of architecture to construction is actually much more complex than what rationalists have very often supposed. It's much more complex, and I would at that stage introduce the notion of fiction. Architecture uses construction in a narrative, and the narrative may be much more complex than structural truth. It may be about something else. So this is by no means recent. You know, when we look at a pilaster, for example, this is the Trianon in Versailles, a pilaster is a fake column. Behind that, actually, there is a wall. There is just a wall. So by using fake column, why suggesting that this wall is actually a trabeated structure with columns and lintels? And then you begin to realize that fiction is an integral part of architectural expression. And it uses very often construction as a narrative. Of course, you can go even further. And for example, Giuliano Romano at Palazzo Te in Mantova, the whole thing is a fiction. You know, actually, this is a brick building. So all these columns, etc., they conceal just a plain brick building. And this is actually pasted. And then Giuliano Romano goes even further with these falling triglyphs, which suggests that, you know, there is almost a kind of instability of the fake construction. So we're in a narrative on the narrative. All that to say that by the end, architecture and construction, it's very seldom about truth as opposed to lie. It's most of the time about telling a story, and which story becomes the question. And this may enable us to understand better why Adolf Loos at the famous Michaelplatz building actually suspend the column. The column are not carrying the lintel, they're suspended to the lintel. So a kind of game on appearance and reality. It enables us also to understand better what Eisenman, as a deconstructionist architect at the time, does at the Ohio Fexner Center. So we realize that actually construction, and more generally technology in architecture, is as much about telling a story than being truthful. So we are in a world in which the objective and the fiction are constantly intermingling, which is also true, for example, at a larger scale. I've argued in a number of texts that actually industrialization itself was, of course, a set of objective technology, but it was also a story, and a story that was supposed to enthrall designers and the public with these beautiful pictures. This is a construction site of Marcel Lodz, and nowhere is this story or this fictional character as true as with Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller is both a highly rationalist builder and at the same time, you know, how to understand his recipe on how to ground a tower, a 4D Maxian tower everywhere in the globe. Very simple, according to the picture on the left. On the right, take a dirigible, take a bomb, drop the bomb, creates a crater, plant the tower like a tree. Of course, we're in the fiction. We're in fiction and is not. And one of the questions would be, what about today's fiction? We should perhaps not forget that lesson, by the way, about AI. AI is, of course, objective, but AI is also a narrative about country architecture. Architecture and technology is permeated by fiction all the time. And you know, this is also true of robots. We will probably never really go into this kind of construction mode that Gramazio and Kohler tested a few years ago, but as a fiction, it is something highly productive. Let me finish this talk by a path that I've explored more recently, which is linked to this notion of the materiality of architecture. And I can see that I still have something like 10 minutes, so that should be enough. I just want to give you some ideas. I'll go back to this idea of materiality, by the way, tomorrow in another presentation I'll give for the joint seminar between Milieu, and myself. So in my most recent work, I've explored, as I say, this other path linked to the notion of materiality. I published a book in French 2 years ago, and next year, a considerably revised and expanded version will appear in English. This is the cover project. So I have a definition of materiality, which is a little bit different from what is usually considered. So first of all, most of the time, we tend to consider materiality as something completely objective. In architecture, you know, when you look at a Wangshu wall like this one, thank you, Philip, by the way, for taking me a few years ago to see that wonderful building. We believe we're in pure objectivity. But actually, to say that something is material is relative to the relation we have with that something. And in addition, it depends on our belief, knowledge, and practice. To give you an example, in the 19th century, a lot of people thought that actually ghosts were visible. You could photograph them. This is actually a guy who, of course, you know, the people who did that had, there again, an interesting relation to truth. But nevertheless, lots of people believe that actually ghosts were much more tangible than what we imagine in our concrete world. To give another example, if today I tell you close your eyes and you're in a car, you're accelerating, you're able to imagine, and we'll go back to this imagination in the body, the effect of acceleration on your body. Of course, this is something that does not relate by much the rise of the automobile and our mechanized society. So all that to say that the relation that we have with what is tangible in the world is actually partly a cultural construct. I don't want to suggest that it's entirely a cultural construct. I'm not a relativist of that type, but it's partly a cultural construct because it depends on our systems of belief, on our science, but also on our technology, and to a very large extent on our technology. And it varies once again. You know, it's pretty clear that with climate change, with the environmental concern that are developing, notions like gradients of humidity and temperature are acquiring little by little a much more tangible character than they used to have in architecture. So that, you know, architects like Philippe Ram or Iñaki Abalos are suggesting that we should build as much with gradients of temperature than with walls and floors. So materiality, I define materiality not as an absolute property, but as a relation, the relation we have to the with the physical world, and the way we relate to it and consider that some things fall literally under the senses. So now, where the argument becomes a bit more complex is that I also believe that materiality does not tell us only something about what is out there. It tells us something about who we are. I was led to this kind of conclusion by actually the reading of an 18th century philosopher, Condillac. Condillac imagines, this is not an engraving from Condillac, did not put an illustration, this is from Descartes, but it's in a way related. Condillac imagines a statue without any senses, and it gives gradually to the statue, it's a philosophical fiction, the vision, hearing, smell, touch, etc., etc. And you may wonder, what is the most important sense? What is the turning point in the statue becoming aware of herself as, you know, related, but at the same time distinct from the world? You could believe it's vision, but it's not vision. For Condillac, it's touch. And touch is the moment in which the statue realized that there are things out there. And because there are things out there that resist to her will, she is in the world, in a material world. And this material world is also what makes her aware that she is indeed in the world, but as a subject. So my argument about materiality, architectural material, the way architecture actually plays with materiality is that it's something that has to do with the relation we have to the world, but also the way we understand ourselves. Architecture makes matter meaningful. It organizes matter not only as an obstacle, but rather as a place in which human can dwell in the world. It creates a kind of theater for human action, which will lead me to the key notion of inhabiting. What does it mean to inhabit? To inhabit means actually to be able to relate to a space in a way that partly defines who we are, who you are. And this is what inhabiting is about. And probably what is at the core of architecture is this capacity to propose inhabiting. Architecture is not the only form of art or production that is able to, that has to do with materials, that has to do with moving large quantities of stuff, etc., etc. Architecture is probably the only discipline that deals with inhabiting. And of course, today, what is a big question is, what does it mean to inhabit in an age of cyborgs? Because with digital culture, it's not only the physical world that has changed, it is us who are changing. We no longer understand ourselves as Vitruvian men and women. We understand ourselves as cyborg-like creatures. So what does it mean to inhabit in this age of digital technology? And inhabiting in an age of AI is also, by the same token, a question. So what does it mean? And how should we redefine it? So to conclude, I would say that construction, if we try to recapitulate all that I've been trying to do, construction is indeed cultural in a broad sense, because guess what? It's about resources, it's about the way people build, it's about the economic system, it's about the politics, etc. Construction is also, cultural, because there are turning points in humanities in which construction plays a role, from the pyramids to the Crystal Palace. Construction is linked to our everyday life, because the way our houses, etc., are made tell us something about our everyday life. Construction is also cultural because the very notion that it mobilizes, like material, structure, and many others, they are actually partly cultural construct. Construction has also to do with concept and affect. It has to do with this fiction. A building is always a fiction. It's a reality, but it's also telling us a story. It's fictional. And ultimately, construction is also part of what organizes our relation to the tangible world. And as such, construction is partly linked to the way we understand ourselves, because materiality is not only about what is out there, but who are we who enter in relation with these materials which are out there. So construction, it may not be truthful in the sense that rationalist or modernist gave to the term, but it contributes to the way architecture deals with the question of materiality. And as such, it's probably the core of the cultural character of architecture. Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen at that stage.
So, Antoine, it's a great lecture. I would like to invite Laurent to follow you and afterwards make the talks, right? So Laurent, would you like to share your screen and keep the lectures, please? Thank you. Antoine, you can
Thank you.
Stay in front of the screen. Good.
Okay, you see and hear me, right?
Yes, no problem. Good.
Thank you. As you might have understood, I'm a historian, and my work has been primarily concerned with history and less with prospection or even futurology. In the current situation, in which we do not even know how tomorrow will be, this limitation might even be of some advantage, as the statistics, which we like to trust and which were the privileged instrument of futurology, go currently crazy. Thus, instead of sketching out a future to come, or maybe not, I would rather like to investigate some questions that came out of the questions themselves that the organizer, especially Philippe Yuan, asked me to answer. The questions were twofold. First, how will the technological culture present in building construction evolve in the contemporary context of globalization and digitalization? And further, what will this technological cyber culture mean for human beings? I decided to start with the questions themselves because they seem already to take some assumptions for granted, to assume that certain divisions in the fields are given. For instance, if there is a technological culture in architecture, as we have been taught for so long, one would have to assume that there is also somewhere outside as its opposite, even as its enemy, or at least independent from it, a non-technological culture. That there is an insider and outsider perspective on architecture, that the one can develop without affecting the other and the other way around. Further, that there is a further divide between the human and the technical, assuming that the technical is non-human, post-human. And finally, that this technological culture is a result of a growing globalization and digitalization, and not the other way around. That culture in general should be rather understood to be the condition in which globalization and digitalization can unfold, as before being economical or technical. The logic of culture is first and foremost social before being technical or economical. So that's my contribution. Rather than developing on future paths, we'll rather try to give, through some historical examples, some insights on how one could look at this path. To be clear, the question raised by the organizers are crucial ones, because indeed there are good reasons to think that today's architecture has become global. The arguments are numerous: globally acting construction and planning corporation, globally working design firms, globally employed tools, technologies, and materials, globally used design and fabrication program, globally circulated reports and architectural press, just to name a few. Possible example of this global trend potentially stretch from the air conditioner to float glass and office carpets, to the elevators, the domino frame and its correlate, the typical plan, up to the programs used to design them. Therefore, there is therefore a solid basis to affirm that these transformations follow what the French ethnographer André Leroy-Gourhan in the mid-1940s called tendencies. That is, transformations that are inevitable, predictable, rectilinear. As examples of global spread, he mentioned the adze, the spindle, and other simple objects showing a similar universality. These tendencies, which characterize technical objects, would lead him to distinguish technical progress from that in other domains, such as society, religion, and morals, by virtue of its continuity and its aptitude to transcend political changes. The work of Leroy-Gourhan is particularly interesting in our context, not only because it deals specifically with technical objects, but perhaps more importantly, as a question of, to put it in contemporary term, global trade is at the center of his investigation, and this up to prehistoric times, investigating, as he does, technologies of acquisitions, like harpoons, or of consumptions, like clothes or buildings. This line of arguments seems particularly valid for architecture since the beginning of the broad reconfiguration of the built environment, from agriculture, via the food industry, to architecture, starting in the early 19th century, first through mechanization, and since the last century through automatization. This is the argument that Laurent Colas very effectively advanced in the 2014 Architectural Biennale for the National Pavilions, comparing the architectural production in 1914 to that of 2014. In doing this, he linked the transformation of architecture from a seemingly national language to a generic one, to the technological advancement of construction on the one side and material on the other. High-rise construction on the one side and mirror glazing on the other. Independently of the approximation of this reading that could be easily challenged, for instance, by comparing public buildings that testify, as for instance, the HSBC Bank in Shanghai, of a similar global spread of typologies, materials, iconographic programs in the late 19th and 20th century, and these examples could be repeated through the 17th and 18th century, then comparison hits to central point of architectural historiography. Indeed, the factors that have vitally transformed architecture in the last 200 years have been less formal accomplishments, like the international style of the 1920s, postmodernism of the 1970s, the constructivism of the 1990s, or parametricism of the 2000s, through which we have been accustomed to describe architecture, but instead the array of new professional expertise, especially in engineering and science, new materials or new technologies that not only historically compelled a comprehensive reorganization of architecture and urban planning, including large-scale reallocations between its various practitioners, but that remains unabated. These changes can be traced at various different levels. At the political level, because this reallocation also represents a transfer in political responsibilities. Consider, for instance, the ever-growing importance of norms. Or at an urban planning level, due to the fact that from this juncture onwards, the city becomes interconnected, not only overground, but also underground in a wide-ranging network of infrastructure. Or at an architectural level, ranging from construction to infrastructure to the equipping of individual buildings with a series of apparatuses transforming homes or labs, as we see here, into genuine machines for living. Modern architecture and its various modern day devices, machines and materials seems therefore a promising testing ground for the historian to confront the universality described by Laurent. To do this, I would like to first describe the technical object in its historical becoming. Then, in a second step, show that this becoming cannot be separated from its technical but also spatial environment. In a third step, argue that this technical environment is deeply embedded in its specific social environment, and finally show how and where the human body comes in. Let's start with a very common, simple, and typically modern object, the revolving door. Patented independently in two different cultural contexts, only years apart, it seems a perfect example of a universal device. The first model was patented in Germany in 1881 as a device consisting of a dual cylindrical unit with the inner space being a rotating one. The second model, also the more successful one, 7 years later in 1888 by Theophilus von Kannel in the United States. Both models set out to supplant the outdated swing door by more efficiently and effectively resolving the contradictory functions inherent in the door as such. Seen from a purely technical perspective, the evolution of the revolving door can be described, or seems to be able to be described, beginning with the first revolving door, followed by doors with speed control, to electric doors, doors with electric motion sensors, up until today's successor with a numerous electric sensor, as the continuous improvement of a basically simple mechanism consisting of 3 or 4 leaves mounted around a central pivot, rotating between 2 curves scutcheon with a retaining pole to avoid the door revolving in 2 directions. Correspondingly, its chronological development and its worldwide success can be understood at first glance, at least, as a resolution deploying ever newer, more coherent structures of the innately contradictory functions of the door as a genus, which are fluidity of passage and total tightness, solidity and lightness, security and ease of use, generic and yet adapted to various users. In other words, a device allowing the entrance to be in an increasingly efficient way, always open, always closed, so famously formulated by Van Kannel in an advertisement. At first, the impact of the technical object in architecture is limited. Ordinarily, they are adaptations or replacement of existing technologies, and often the transformations occur without any immediate impact on their milieu. The revolving door simply replaced the wing door. In the Wertheim building in Berlin, built by famous architect Alfred Messel, for example, the two systems coexist. While the door on the main square is replaced, the other with vestibule towards the streets are kept in place. Similarly, early bath tubes, like the warm bath apparatus of 1850, were transportable from room to room. The first French elevator were inserted into the stairwells of Haussmann's housing blocks. Enneby's first steel concrete floor simply replaced previously non-fireproof metal floors. Yet, reducing the suitability of a technical object to its technical dimension, the revolving door to the rotating mechanism, an elevator to the cable or piston system, contemporary climate regulation system to the algorithm of the switch, is not necessarily wrong, but it falls too short, because it does not take in account that different technical solutions can answer a similar task. The technical artifact is ultimately characterized not only by its material means, the mechanical or electronic solution, but equally and more importantly by the purposes bound to it as a technical artifact, the purposes. This is why two different technical systems can coexist, having a similar function, but varying in its technology. A case in point, analogous to the two patents of the revolving door, are the different technologies used to propel elevators, on the one hand in Europe and the other in the USA in the second half of the 19th century. While the French relied on a hydraulic system with pistons, as we can see in the World Exhibition of 1867, reflecting the general European distrust of suspended elevators, commonly used till the 19th century in mining and therefore associated with accidents. The American firm Otis used cables while relying on safety ducts that would arrest the cable car in case of rupture of the rope. While the function is similar, the technology is not. The difference between the two systems would become apparent and comparable only during the erection of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, when the former was outdone by the latter due to the impossibility of deploying it in the convex curves of the tower legs, and thus forcing the organizer to bypass the World's Fair Charter to use only local contractors because they had to rely on the Otis system. While the suspension of the cable car allowed an easy adaptation of the geometry of the tower, the French system had a continuous chain that would, again showing the European distrust for suspension, not draw, but push the car and could only reach the first stage of the tower. In its primal form, the technical object is an abstract one. It leads its own existence, functions according to its own laws and independently of other objects. Above all, it is independent of the shell of the building. It lodges itself in it or slightly pierces its tectonic boundaries. Because of its autonomy in this primitive form, the technical object constitutes a theoretical and material entity. In its becoming, however, and this is my second point, the formally abstract, autonomous, technical assumes concreteness as it emerges to form part of a whole technological ensemble, where the different elements have to be coordinated with each other, as well as with the traditional tectonic frame and the spatial constellations of the building, less in the form of compromises, but instead because of their simultaneousness. The individual performance of the technical object has to be integrated in the overall functioning of the system called building. The examples are multiple. Thus, the revolving door is part of the overall circulation system of the high-rise building, or in the case of Berlin, of the department store, in that it enables a blocking of the suction effect created by the rising air in the stairwells or elevator shafts or in the big sales halls, as we can see here in Berlin in the Alfred Messel sales store. Similarly, the toilet, the bath, or the kitchen become part of an ensemble that includes running water, heaters, and pipes, challenging the current layout of apartments, as from now on, all the wet rooms have to be superposed. Or, as another example, the air conditioning plan of the well-tempered environment of the corporate office building in the late 1950s is, to take it as a third example, coupled with the steel facade, artificial lighting, and the steel frame. This would lead in the UN building to an incorporation of the air conditioning ducts in the structural layers of the floor to gain precious space, as Wolf Boyer has argued in his close reading of New York high-rise buildings of the 1950s. To analyze the relation of the technical object in architecture solely in relation to its technical milieu is therefore insufficient in architecture, as the aforementioned examples show a simultaneity not only between individual technical devices, but encompasses similarly building materials, building elements, and architectural space. To come back to the example of the elevator, why is the elevator transform as its primary goal the circulation in a building by accelerating and increasing its performance, while cabin, shaft, rope, or piston and technical spaces have to be coordinated? It at the same time, and as a consequence, participates more greatly in the reorganization of the building's floor and section by inevitably aligning them around the core. Yet, and more importantly, by questioning the vertical hierarchies of a building, it also reverses its social order, profoundly altering the relationship between the private and the public. Whereas in New York, the elevator propelled the replacement of the urban villa by high-rise apartment buildings, substitute by lifting the former, in certain cases, literally into the air. In Paris, it often became accommodated within existing buildings, or at least till the post-war within existing urban regulations. A good example of this is the famous apartment building by Perrin on the Rue Franklin, Paris. There, all the flats have, so to say, the same distance of reach from the ground floor, or at least request, thanks to the elevator, the same effort to be reached, thus allowing a stapling of almost identical flats throughout the building, or as others have put it, similar villas with two wings. So this distinguishes, for instance, the 20th century from the 19th century apartment buildings. Yet further, thanks to the reversing of the inner core to the street and to the dissolving of the facade into a front of windows, thanks to the anebic construction system, it also completely changes the relation of the apartments to the outside, transforming the previously introverted, stapled apartment into observatories with panoramic views over the city. Indeed, the effectiveness of a technical invention is dependent on the virtual milieu that it presupposes. It integrates it, it is altered by it, while at the same time it changes it. The technical object, and this is my third point, does not only articulate its technical and material functions, but similarly its social, environmental, or even political ones. This explains, as Slavoj Žižek, reflecting on the concept of fantasy, has noted, why even technical objects express ideological contents that are made visible in our everyday life. Correspondingly, to come back to our example, the revolving door does not only allow the fluid passage of people, does not only block the suction effect created by rising air in stairwells and elevator shafts, but it similarly answers other requirements as well of comfort, in that the revolving door can more efficiently deal with the stream of people in a large city, without the disadvantages of a constantly open door, of hygiene, in that due to its compartmentalization, the door prevents the gusts of wind and employees and lift boys were exposed to with the swing door. And even of social conception, is that due to its partition mechanism, the revolving door separates, particularly in Grand Hotel, as been shown by Murnau, guests from common passers-by. Or even misappropriation, as when it is transformed into a death trap in Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather. Because a technical object in architecture, as these examples show, is far from linear in its becoming, or as Paul Virilio has pointed out, it encompasses by far the intention of its inventors. Indeed, the importance of the milieu of a technical object is even more visible when it fails. Thus, the revolving door, despite it having been its inventor's intention, and also proposed again in the 1920s by the Bauhaus student Friedel Dicker and Franz Singer to replace the corridor between kitchen, living, dining, and bedrooms, noticeably failed to prevail in house building, instead only became successful in the amenable milieu of the high-rise, with its flow of peoples, of air, of energy, of dust. While in the drawing, the device seems to act as a potent sign of the different movement involved. In practice, a normal door would be largely sufficient. Finally,
go on,
and more crucially,
are you coming to the
and this is my fourth point,
dance? Oh my God, how I shall dance. I want to feel it in vain.
technical objects are only complete in their interactions with humans. They are, as Bruno Latour expressed it, anthropomorph, not only because they are made for man and by man, not only because they have the potential to replace humans, but more importantly, because they similarly shape human behaviors. Indeed, any technical device, and to this we should add architecture in general, exists and performs only in answer to and in conjunction with the human with which it interacts. Aspects that manifest themselves most clearly with the repeated use of the device over time. It is no coincidence that numerous films have exploited this as a subject. The slapstick of the revolving door of the sanatorium in Charlie Chaplin's The Cure, that of Jacques Tati in the elevator and working cubicle of a generic office in Playtime, or that of Tom Hanks on the escalator in the movie Terminal, or simply in the movie I just showed, the love scene in the Grand Hotel which are all explicit examples. Between the strategies of comfort and discipline, the user is fixed within the plan, so to speak, of the technical object, the normative body of modernity shaped by the mechanical device or machine, the prosthetic body of today modulated by its electronic successors. All these specific examples explain the necessity of historical research to counteract the overarching tendencies with historical facts, as the aforementioned Laurent Agouran rightly stated. Historical facts, in the words of the ethnographer, when speaking of the axe, the slate, the sail, but also namely the bridge, due to the locality, and due to the specific social context in which they happen, are the forms in which tendencies find their concretization. In opposition to the tendencies and their universal dimension, they are unique, inextensible, and unstable compromise. Several degrees of the specific dimension of historical facts in architecture can be distinguished, and I hope I've shown them. The materiality, stone, wood, metal, or today's composite material. The functionality of the technical object, sliding door, revolving door, window. Its technical milieu, that is a relation to other technical objects. In the case of the revolving door, for instance, the elevator shaft, or even the air conditioner as guarantee of a well-tempered interior. Its social and historical milieu, that is, and again, in the case of the revolving door, the mass society with its office clerks, or its mass consumers. And one might add the specific design in a single location by a singular author. To conclude, let's come back to the question with which we began this talk. Transformations in architecture are, in their essence, neither universal nor of a solely technical nature. They not only reflect the rationale of increasingly refined technological systems, but also span a discursive arc between contradictory notions of comfort, security, or hygiene on the one hand, and disciplinary measures and control on the other, just to take some modern concepts. In the multiplication of small anonymous architecture in the course of the 19th and 20th century, but similarly in the large infrastructure of cities or in the countryside, the dispersed, reduced, and polyvalent field of contemporary social practice appears at last to have found its material correlation. Such narratives, which serve to structure and organize space, are made manifest in the numerous apparatuses that complement our traditional buildings. To therefore analyze these objects only from a merely technical perspective, or on the contrary, simply as signs of representations, like objects of desire, of commodity, or mythology, does justice neither to the complex networks of actors involved, nor to the technical and material ingenuity. They are both at the time. They matter in their materiality, technical refinement, but similarly because they are the result of an intense negotiation between different interests. This adding of a social and historical context does not mean stripping the technical object of their concreteness or even of their technical mastery, but on the contrary, it means adding reality to them by merging them with the complex, historically situated and richly diverse matters of concern in which they are situated. It would therefore seem reductive to causally link the question of technology to globalization, thus perpetuating the modern trope of a divide between the cultural and the technological, between what is local and historical and what is global and progressive. This reduces the technical object in both its meaning and its scope, because it either robs it of its materiality in favor of its social construction, or on the contrary, ignores the ideological dimension of any technical invention. This divide is based, as the French philosopher of technology Gilbert Simondon has argued, on the one side, on an understanding of the culture as a defense system against technology, as viewed as a threat to humanity. From this perspective, the technological is considered as something outside the cultural realm, as either inhuman or even non-human, as a robot, or simply as an assemblage of matter. Consequently, out of this thinking, while certain objects, especially aesthetic ones, are understood as belongings to the world of significations, technological ones are denied any place in it whatsoever. This biased view, which banishes the culture from the technological, is countermanded on the other side by the tendency of the engineers or men who have the knowledge to be much broader, to accord them the status of sacred objects. Humanity is there delegated to the android machine, the man-like machine. This can take the form of the thinking machine, the voliation machine, or the living machine, but all of them are expression of the technocratic aspiration of unconditional power. Even more so, one should add, in economic or a political system that follows in this reductive understanding of technology, its solely performative logic. To restore the true character of culture, as Simondon pleads, it would therefore be necessary not only to reintroduce an awareness of machine as belonging to the realm of man, but also to restore the relation between machines and man. Only through this expansion of the culture, which includes technology as a central human activity, can culture once again reinstall its regularity dimension in society through norms, precepts, or procedures. Architecture has been quite successful in doing it. It's often criticized. Slowness should therefore not be seen as a slowing down of technological transformation, but rather as loading it with signification, with more reality. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot to the fabulous lecture from Laurent. So Antoine, would you like to firstly make some comments or put forward some questions to Laurent lecture? Or shall we?
Antoine.
So sorry, Antoine. Right now,
There it should be able to hear me. Well, I've read Laurent a number of times. I really think this is a very productive way to envisage the architectural question. I have a question which is actually very close to what somebody raised in, using the chat, which is, how do you see the architect agency vis-a-vis these fascinating objects? Because, what you've described is in some ways an ecology, a kind of technological ecology, etc. So how do you posit the architect agency? Sorry for stress passing on the question of the chat, but I had exactly the same question, because in some ways it seems to call for more anonymous production of the building environment. Related question for me would be, by the way, how do you position yourself vis-a-vis Coullas elements?
Yes. Okay, two questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine, for the lecture, and for the question, and thank you also very much for your lecture, which I enjoyed extremely too. I think it has a lot to do with tacit knowledge, or a knowledge which is not somehow expressed neither in the architectural education, nor in the architectural publication, nor in the architectural discourse. And what interests me in doing this unwrapping somehow is to show how through history we can again and again see extremely important buildings like the Rue Franklin, which integrate somehow all these new technologies, but that who is able to give them signification. So signification of the splitting of the floors, so their social reorganization, using the domino, not just the way of constructing, but somehow also of developing a new plan and even engaging with a new relation with the city. So for me, it's absolutely not a contradiction, but it's much more raising an awareness, giving somehow the architects the tools to engage with what they would have to engage every day. And even there are also good examples where architects engage with specific objects, like, for instance, Herzog de Meuron with glass production, where they could somehow bring their own agency into the factory. Another good example would be in Brazil, Lele, who controlled the whole construction process from the factory up to the building site. And the second question was the elements. I think the elements is very interesting if you compare somehow the comments Semper did when visiting the Crystal Palace in 1851. He says, how can you organize all this stuff? And you can organize it by nations, you can organize it by production process, you can organize in between raw materials up to art. But he says this doesn't understand, this is not yet an architectural position towards it. And that's how he proposes then his 4 elements of architecture. And I think a similar approach should be given also to, or critique could be given to Rem Koolhaas. I think it was wonderful that he exposed these elements, but I think the logic is still a logic which seems to me very random. Sometimes you have the impression it's the logic of the producer, sometimes you have the impression it's the logic of IKEA, also of the, how you say it, the furniture factories, and sometimes there is a historian doing in it. And I don't think there is yet a stance. For instance, I would think it would be extremely interesting not to oppose the corridor and the pipes, but to think them as 2 ways, or think them through the notion of communication somehow, as Alberti does, by the way, when speaking about stairs and chimneys, or not to divide between walls and partitions, or walls and columns, but somehow to think about the question of load bearing, and so on. I think what was missing, in my opinion, was somehow an architectural perspective on it.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have a question to Antoine. I think it's very interesting today you put forward construction as kind of a truth and fiction process, as a narrative, creative process to produce certain kind of buildings which based on not only the cultural aspects, but also not only the technology aspects, but also the cultural narrative process as well. That's really interesting. And also you put forward the materiality as a kind of relation, as kind of relationship of this kind of visible or invisible process to create, to build a design architecture. So which matters the subjectivity and objectivity. I want to put forward a question on that. I think right now, because of in these days, we have a lot talking about the subjectivity, because which is under transformation, how to define the boundary of subjectivity for the construction process, which is not just matters to me, which just matters about the elements of buildings, but which matters the human behavior engagement into the construction ideology, because not only right now the human can make a design, but also some visible instruments or plug-in tools, which can give us a lot opportunity to review some invisible process or invisible aspects of architecture, which could generate a certain kind of new fictions. That fiction may be the narrative fiction, which is not just the physical part, visible part of architecture, but something which can be invisible, which you put forward as like the thermodynamic visualization diagrams, which probably could give us a new kind of feedback to construct the building in a different kind of logic. So my question goes to the subjectivity or the boundary of the who actually is the thinking, the core of thinking in the design process, to address us back to who is the subjectivity. So who is subjectivity of the design process? Is that still the human, or that is expanding of the human, maybe including the human and some ethical feedback or some reasonable feedback can review some the special relationship between the human being and the environment. So that's, if it's clear about the subjectivity and the boundary of the creative process.
Thank you, Philip. Difficult question. I'll start perhaps by the fiction, just to say one thing, which is because of the urgency of climate change, because of the political turmoil, etc., there is a tendency sometimes to believe that we should just look for the objective. But I think it is important to keep in mind that design is about as much about telling stories, and that actually the world in which we live is partially fictional. You know, Neil Leach, you know, in the first meeting of the seminar reminded us that in some ways we remember or fantasize as much as we perceive. So the world is partly that. Now on the subject, I do think what I found interesting in the notion of materiality is that it is actually not necessarily one subjectivity, it's a distributed subjectivity. I think the future of design will be probably more into trying to think beyond simply the head of the designer. Try to think, you know, this is why I find the notion of inhabiting interesting, because inhabiting is partly determined almost by biological species logic, but also inhabiting can be the contribution of a designer who may modify at the margin, etc. But I think there is a certain urgency today to go beyond just what lies in the designer's head. So that's for me the biggest challenge of subjectivity, how to imagine, because basically we've theorized design almost always as an expression of you know, a privileged subjectivity, forgetting very often that first, actually most architectural practices are collective, that, as you know better than I, you know, since you've created these kind of cooperative of means, that actually sharing, etc., you know, we are actually, you know, we have to imagine collective form of subjectivities, and which also should also challenge a little bit the distinction between designers and users. Actually, what I found interesting, the notion of inhabiting, is that inhabiting is something that is co-created by designers and users, and not on one side only. And I was sensitive by the same token to Laurent kind of implicit ecological thought about technical objects. As you say, technical objects are not isolated as artifacts. They are actually related to all sorts of networks, etc. So I think that's where probably for me, that's why I got interested in this question of materiality as a kind of relational and encompassing type of relation. So that would be my answer. But probably I think one of the greatest challenges for the near future for theorist, historian, but also, and above all practitioner, will be actually to finally abandon the kind of frame in which we've thought architectural production for so many centuries, and to really, you know, rethink of it as a collective, which is kind of paradoxical in an age of star system, in which we have hypertrophied individuality, you know, think of the archangels, etc., etc. But I think we're reaching a moment in which actually we have to go beyond that. And so I think that will be the challenge. And I think, yeah, that the interest of technology is also to be able to go beyond that. So for me, the two interests of technology, probably one which I try to convey, is to remember that technology, we often believe, is the most objective thing, but it's actually permeated by fiction. And the other thing for me is this kind of collective mode of existence of things, which is very different from the traditional accounts we give of the architectural discipline.
Yeah. So here is a quick question from the audience. Actually, I see we have around 3,000 audience maximum in China, and around 1,000 in outside China on YouTube. So it's a great audience, big number of audience right now looking at this talk. So a question from the audience to Laurent. The question goes to, as most of the examples that you introduce mechanical elements like revolving door, elevators, etc. He is wondering if, in your opinion, there are conceptual difference between the architectural elements and the mechanical elements. Can the column, as mentioned by Picon, be considered as technical objects? So that's a question. And Laurent, would you like to give some feedback on that?
This is a difficult question, but it has a lot to do also with the way architectural trade has been organized, and how the different trades have been separated, and how the different responsibilities have been given. For instance, you wouldn't trust the mechanical engineer as a calculation of your column. You would better take a structural engineer. And the same somehow with the revolving door or the sanitary conditions. But I think this is also a problem somehow in our way of understanding, and that's why I like very much the idea of somehow coming back to the living as a habitat, or maybe an environment somewhere where this classification at the end don't matter. Of course, they matter for a structural condition, because of course they matter in the construction process, of course they matter in the fabrication process, but at the end somehow it's about an environment in which you are living. And that's why I think the relation is so important between a spatial organization, a device, a construction system, which again, to take the example of the Rue Franklin, was so masterly developed, but you could find millions of similar examples, or even the sales house and especially the American sales stores, which suddenly have to open completely the facade to have a completely open accessibility, but at the same time have to master technical and climatic questions. So I don't know if it goes a little bit into Antoine's discussion about how we define what we are dealing with, and that's what's for me very inspiring when you somehow questions the notions itself of material or of structure, and perhaps also to say that at a certain moment it's perhaps more the function or the performance which are at stake, and less the historical given definition.
If I may just jump in, I think in architecture we've had also a tendency to fetishize categories. And what you realize is that objects, and categories are shifting. We talked about ornament at some point in the other seminar, and one of the classic difficulty in architecture is actually to categorize what is an ornament, because a column can be an ornament at a certain scale and can be not an ornament at another scale. And I think probably an answer related to what Laurent just said is to say that at a certain scale, things appear as technical objects. As another scale, they don't. I think architecture, and this is, for me, that was the biggest problem with the elements of Coulas, is that he forgot that actually elements can be actually not elements at another scale. So it depends at which scale you look at things. There again, we've had such a fixist version of vision architecture that we tend to forget that actually most of the categories and of objects that we manipulate are actually relative.
Yes, I have one more question. I think both of you mentioned about the behavior. That is matters the human, how they have experience in some kind of space. I think as an infrastructure system is kind of mechanical, or the circulation elements, or the architecture elements, which can give us an infrastructure system. to the building. But at the same time, the narrative process, including the Picon mentioned this kind of fictional space, which is actually like a phenomenological collage of different kind of phenomenon of the buildings to create certain kind of behavior experience. That is something from the technology perspective. Normally, right now, we give abundant boundary to create a maximum possibility, normally in the spatial design process. But at the same time, when we talk about Bernard Jim, he has mentioned about this kind of event collage space for this kind of timing process in a certain kind of space, which also relate to this kind of AI architecture, artificial intelligence, like Daniel, who is used to some machine learning to set up some connection by the learning process of different phenomenological collage based on some kind of image collage to the boundary of the space. That is something quite a great challenge to the design subject, because the design subject right now is not the human mental imagination process. It's not a mindscape in the human being's brain. It is something outside the body, which is something like a collage or structure based on certain kind of phenomenological image, which can create a new behavior experience. So I mean, from the historical perspective, maybe we are talking about the social process, the social pattern, which can give us certain kind of fundamental creative process by the reorganization of this kind of elements. But right now, because of the new technology, which engage into the design process, imagine process, and also the narrative frictional process. So is that certain kind of challenge right now? I want to give feedback to this whole talk series, and it's not about this talk, which we invite a lot of like different kind of practitioner or expertise in digital in architecture. So I would like to ask from the theoretical or historical perspective to both of you. So what's your thinking on this kind of cyber process of the technology in architecture, or this kind of new cultural aspects in architecture?
Actually, you, Antoine, you already pointed out the Vitruvian man. I think between the Vitruvian man, the modern man, and the contemporary man or woman, of course, there is a big difference. And that's why the slapsticks of Charlie Chaplin, unfortunately, I didn't show them, but are so interesting, because it shows exactly that, for instance, the revolving door, if the body is not the normative body of modernity, which is the young masculine body, well-trained, accidents happen. And so the weaker are excluded. And if you look at the reports of the time, as James Bouzard from MIT have shown, you will see that the most accidents are with children and old persons, which are not accepted somehow by the machine. And you can see a very nice parallel, I think, between this technical device and Le Corbusier's conception of the normative, as well as, for instance, this famous handbook Neufert, which goes from a very typical body. And if you go to the contemporary time, you perhaps also discover that if you look through different entrance devices, like in the airports, you discover that, of course, the old technology is still valid for mass public, but also for climate conditions. But then that certain new data are collected through this process. And so the body has to go over all these different devices to be somehow reconstituted as a full body. And this has also a consequence, I think, in architectural design that Sloterdijk describes so well. He doesn't speak anymore about space, which is something uniform, total, but much more about very specific and functionally determined spheres, but which can somehow interfere one in the other. And so somehow being a human would mean going from sphere to sphere.
Okay, I think I'm going to echo a little bit what Laurent said.
Good.
I think one of the things that technology is about or is related to is the simultaneous definition or constant redefinition of what is out there, let's say the physical world, and who we are. And I think technology is a mediation between the two. And because of that, it participates both in the evolution of these very fluctuating notion that we call nature sometimes, but actually nature is not a fixed thing, it's a constantly evolving thing, and also the way we understand ourselves. So this is what got me initially to the question of materialities, because actually I've been writing for many, many years that the digital is not a dematerialization, it's a different materialization. The digital has redefined the physical world and is redefining also who we are. And I think if we want to, so that's one thing. So in some ways, often I tend to think that I'm a kind of weird phenomenologist who would accept that actually there is no fundamental and completely fixed human body and etc., but things evolve. That said, as an historian, I think also we are layered. That's to say, part of ourselves have not completely forgotten, just like our brain has layers, which date back from different moments in the evolution that produced who we are right now. We have a layered experience, which is why actually also we're still able to appreciate architecture from other age or other civilizations, because we have depth and layers which are not completely coherent one with another. So which complexifies also the question of inhabiting, by the way. Why is it that in the 21st century we still find a fireplace reassuring? So part of it, and I think part of it is, of course, that the fire in itself and has some properties which we enjoy, but also part of it is also because we have these layered identities, experience of the physical world and of ourselves, etc., etc. So we have to play with that. I think, by the way, that will be one of the challenge of the digital, will be how to insert itself in these prodigious layering that has created, what we call design or architecture or whatever. I think the question, because by the end, the digital will be another layer. So how does it plug into these other layers is a question for us. So I don't know whether I've completely, but I think this is why also at that given moment, we need to re-anchor the digital into some kind of longer historical perspective, which is why also I really enjoyed Laurent, because showing all these complexities, etc., they are absolutely necessary to take into account today.
Okay, I have one more quick question. I think in the process, it's really interesting talking about the, both of you mentioned the daily life, everyday life, everyday social life, which actually have a very meaningful, important feedback to the construction history and the technology history, which is, from my understanding, from Picon's opinion, it's not just a representation of a technology collage or technology reorganization in the design process, which is matters more about the human behaviors, which should be by the everyday life. So that is a very interesting discussion, because some elements of the buildings, maybe the facade you mentioned, like the arch, this kind of very structural elements, which can be translated or could be redesigned in the history and represent in a different kind of ways in the whole architecture history. At the same time, I think from technology perspective, because right now it's like a very it's a booming time for the new, like for example, the structure technology or the a lot of simulation or optimization technology really goes to the engage into the design process actually. But right now the paradox to the designers, especially to the researchers, I think we have a lot of high advanced technology, but actually the real design process goes to like the post-rationalization of certain kind of pattern, maybe which is a certain kind of social pattern in the design process. But so how to analyze this kind of contradiction, because the real building representation is not just the technology representation, which is a very big gap between this kind of creative process. So which is also borrowing a lot of discussion in architecture, because sometimes the buildings, as you mentioned, is quite fictional design process, which is not just purely goes to a technology design process. So I mean, because it's kind of daily life or the unprofessional creative or construction process, which gives the building different kinds of transformation. And at the same time, the new knowledge coming in and more and more advanced plugin or this kind of a technology authorship goes to design process. But at the same time, we find this kind of gap between the cultural understanding of the architecture design or the production process. So it's quite big gap. So I wonder how would you like to analyze the understanding of this kind of creative design thinking, and how to understand this kind of phenomenon in architecture world?
I think I'll go back to the idea of fiction, because we think of fiction usually as something that floats out there. It's actually much more powerful than that. I think if you take modernity, I think one of the things that worked in modernity at some point was through a narrative about what it meant to be modern, it enabled to articulate the life of people in buildings and the experiments made by the designer. You know, if you take Le Corbusier, for example, Le Corbusier, you know, one of the reasons the unité d'habitation worked, many inhabitants, etc., were not only because they were nicely designed, because they gave the people who lived in it the impression to live an adventure. So we need narrative in architecture in order also to articulate, you know, the kind of ethereal discourse of the designer with the everyday life that people will live in the buildings. And so strangely, the narrative is a way, a little bit like the revolving door. Listening to Laurent, we're thinking, wow, the revolving door is actually so full of stories. And actually, when you go through a revolving door, and I was thinking, when you go through a revolving door, you are actually part of a history in which you've seen films, you've seen a layering there again of things which create a narrative, which had to do, by the way, at a certain point also with what it meant to be modern, because it was the modern door for modern facilities, restaurant, hotels, etc., etc. So I think we need narrative, strangely, not only to, you know, to float out in the air, but to very concretely articulate everyday life with designers' preoccupation, etc. I would say that one of the problems of the digital so far is that it has not created a narrative that can address this kind of issue. It has created a narrative only for designers, but we need narrative in which people and their life can play a role. That was the great power of modernism, to tell a story that was a story for everyone. And I think we need, in the age of artificial intelligence, I think artificial intelligence is actually an opportunity to finally find a discourse that will speak both to the designer and to the everyday user.
Good. And I think we have several minutes. The last question to both of you goes to the topic of today on the relationship between the construction and the cultural aspects. So how would you like to use a very simple conclusion to address this kind of technology and the social process and the cultural process to the digital futures, the topic of this conference? Would you like to say something to set up certain kind of relationship between the cultural, technical aspects in the digital futures?
Laurent, or in some ways I already gave my conclusion, so Laurent.
Yes, actually, in the question you raised, for me, there is a key issue, is that it seems to me that there is a confusion between technology and knowledge. Somehow that, and especially in the universities, where somehow we believe that we can, through technology, enhance or change things. And that this technology doesn't allow us, as I think we have both showed throughout this conference, to produce better knowledge, to construct new history and new fictions, and not just provide a solution. It may be a little bit banal what I'm saying, but I'm going to refer to a talk you gave, Antoine, some years ago at ETH, and where you gave a very interesting, or you gave a kind of key element where you said, engineers resolve things, architecture gives them sense or signification. And this was somehow a very useful tool also. I think the conference I did somehow, and the movies I used today, is somehow exactly this, to give a sense to the world which surrounds us. And by questioning the causality, which I think both of us have been questioning, and by questioning the difference between knowledge and technology, I think we could do a big step in this direction.
Okay, so fabulous lectures from both of you, and great talks between Antoine and Laurent. It's great thanks for your participation. And I think I invite Antoine to come to China twice, and in the future, I'm looking forward to invite both of you coming to China when it's convenient. We are doing very experimental research in the robotic future, and which is really goes to some scenarios to the architecture discipline. So I'm looking forward to address what our research, not only in the present situation, but also goes to the historical perspective, to the theoretical perspective, which is really interesting and really important actually when we talk about digital futures. So thanks a lot for your coming.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much.
With you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.